It's very clear when you look at the slides that were presented earlier as to why we decided to come up with a theme for this conference as the future of real estate, pretty much because none of us wanted to have to look back. So there's certainly no one more appropriate to talk to us about the future than the strategic forecaster and lifestyles editor of the Futurist magazine. I'm very, very pleased that David Snyder has come in to join us for this conference. David is a consulting futurist who began his career in forecasting with the U.S. Census Bureau in 1959. He later served with the Rand Corporation and directed long-range planning at the IRS. For the past 40 years, David and his network of scanners have monitored both print and electronic media for long-term trends and forecasts that reflect future changes in society, the economy, and technology. He has written hundreds of published articles and co-authored 5 books on the future. Since 1979, he has been the contributing editor of the Futurist magazine, published by the World Future Society in Bethesda, Maryland. David also serves on the editorial board of On the Horizon. Quote, "The future evolves in an orderly fashion out of the realities of the past, filtered and shaped by the decisions of the present." So please join me in welcoming David. And come on up, David, and tell us what you see in the future. Do you have a mic? Oh, you got your mic on.
It's mostly empty.
Thank you very much. It is, in fact, a great pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to welcome you to the new normal.
I think there's 2 or 3 graduates.
Now, how many of you have heard or read the phrase new normal in the last year or so? Okay, that raises the first question, because Skipper originally said, oh, don't call it new normal. People may not have heard that. So, it's clear. Most people have heard the phrase new normal. Now, in fact, the specific content of my program is spelled out in the subtitle. I'm going to talk to you about demographic, economic, technologic trends and developments, but that sounds sort of prosaic and dull. The new normal has a sense of mystery to it. Because while most of you put your hands up and said you'd heard about the new normal, how many of you are confident that you understand what people mean when they say the new normal? Let me see hands. There you go. So I'm going to answer the question in your mind. What is the new normal? And to start with, in fact, we can just look at the 2 words, new normal. First of all, Webster tells us that something that is new is something that has not been true recently. There we go. That it's only been in existence for a short time. And something that is normal, or has become normal, is likely to stay that way for a while. So here we're dealing with some new circumstances that are going to be around for a while. In fact, if we accept the notion that we are now living in a new normal, it means that sometime in the recent past we have crossed over a threshold from the past and we've now entered a future. And because it's called the new normal, it says that future is going to be strikingly different from the past we have just left. So that puts us on notice. Now, I'm going to now whisk you down the tunnel of data and give you the hard data that tells us what is going to be normal from now on in the society, in the economy, in technology that has not been normal up till now. That will constitute the business operating environment within which real estate will be a part of the economy in the new normal. And as we enter the tunnel of data, the first thing that we are informed is that we've now entered the new normal. Be prepared for an older society. And a lot of people say, oh, that's not new. We've been talking about the older society, the maturing society for years. Yes, this is true, but we are about to pass over a threshold that makes the old society really old. And here's what it is. This lovely graph shows the changing age makeup of the US population from 1950 through the year 2020. And this roller coaster is caused, of course, by the baby boom. Here's the baby boomers when they were 16 to 24-year-olds, and they made up a quarter of the population, adult population. And then they matured, at least chronologically, and became 25 to 34-year-olds, and then 35 to 44-year-olds, and 45 to 54-year-olds, and now, oh, what happened to them then? Oh, they added to the 54 to 65-year-old group, but they're way down here, very small share of the society. Why on earth were the 55 to 64-year-olds such a small share of the society back in the 1990s? Well, it's because in the 90s, if you were 55 to 65, you were born in the Great Depression. And the economic outlook back then was so rotten that the marriage and birth rates fell by more than a third. So there weren't many of us turned out during the 1930s. Fortunately for the nation, the quality was unusually high. And so we were able to prosper in spite of that small generation. Well, now, here come the boomers adding on to that. And suddenly the share of the population that is 54 to 65 goes from being about 12% up to 14%, 12%. And then the first of the boomers last year, for the first time, turned 65. Well, here's the over 65 line here. And this little bump here is the leftovers from the baby boom after World War I. So there was a little historic blurb, but by and large, over 65 population has for decades made up about 14% of the population. But it started to take off last year as the boomers moved into that group, and it's going to go straight up. By 2015, the over 65 population breaks out and becomes the largest group in our adult society. And by 2020, it will be 23% of the society. By 2025, 1 out of 4 adults in America will be over 65. Geezers rule. Wow. Think about that. Walking down the street, you're going to see 1 out of 4 people you see in the street are going to be over 65. That's impressive. What's even more impressive is as the over 65-year-old crowd grows, the entry-level labor pool, once the boomers there, and here's the baby boom echo, doop, doop, and now it's going down. The entry-level labor pool is shrinking at a time that the exit-level labor pool is growing rapidly. And it says as the boomers retire, there aren't going to be nearly enough people in the entry-level labor pool to replace them. So we run into what everybody agrees is going to be a big problem from now on. There's going to be a shortage of digital natives. In fact, we can see this right here. This is the projection of the labor force through 2018 from BLS. And what it tells us is that the entry-level labor pool is actually going to shrink by about 4%, 5% over the next 10 years. And as a consequence, there won't be enough people to replace the retiring boomers. Shortage of labor means A, the price of labor will go up, and B, business will do anything it can to reduce its labor requirements, and that means by and large replacing labor with machinery. All of this suggests that the demand for commercial space to house lots of employees will be under considerable pressure because the marketplace will be under pressure to reduce its reliance on labor. Then the striking thing is that the over 55-year-old share of the workforce, the retirement age folks, they are going to skyrocket by 43%. They're going to be a quarter of the workforce almost by 2018, certainly by 2020. The baby boomers have been all of your lives the largest age cohort in our society, and they will continue to be the largest age cohort in society. So we ought to pay a little attention to what's happening in the lives of the boomers now. So what do we know about the lives of the boomers? First of all, the boomers have made it clear in survey after survey, they don't plan to retire young like previous folks have. Most of them living longer than their parents did, and most of them didn't save enough to retire anyway. So in fact, AARP says about 45% are going to say they plan to work until their 70s. About a quarter of them plan to work until they're in the 80s. Those who retire, 20% of them say they're going to start their own business. And most of them are telling us that they plan to age in place. That is, they don't plan to relocate to a retirement home. Oh, about 50%. There was always about a third of the population who did not relocate when they retired. But the other 2/3 always did, and they typically moved to the Sun Belt, and they were a fountain for the growth of Florida's economy. But now, over half of Americans say they don't plan to relocate when they retire. They plan to stay there where all of their friends and professional contacts are, where their church congregation is that they've been with for years and years and years. And another reason why they're staying in place is currently the baby boomers, about 52% of them are the principal caregivers for their aging parents. In fact, 18% of boomers have one or more aging relative living in their own home with them. And surveys of boomer families say that that number is likely to double within just 5 years. Granny flats and in-law add-ons going in all over the suburbs of the North. Or conversely, if you're clever enough in marketing it, you may want to create multiple generation households or buildings for folks to move down here, and they can live and mutually support one another in the Sun Belt instead of up north. Indeed, many of the big builders like KB and Lennar are telling us they are building houses with separate granny flats right built in with them in order to attract those two-generation retiree households. Now, the boomers have another problem. Somewhere between 80 and 90% of their offspring now return home after graduation because they have such a high student debt and they can't afford to pay rent. And they say, gee, Mom and Dad, if I could come and move in with you and be rent-free, I'd be able to pay off the debt that much quicker. Well, better you than me, son. Sure, come on back. The problem is that a lot of them don't leave. A third of them stay for prolonged periods of time. In fact, the demographers already have a name for this generation. This is the baby boomerang. You throw them out of the house and they come right back. Often with spouses and children in tow. Oh, this is not fun. And as a consequence, the fastest growing kind of household in America today is the good old-fashioned extended household, 3 generations. Wow, just like the Waltons, right? We said goodbye to the extended household back when we moved out of the agricultural era into the industrial age, where the nuclear household was the standard. Mom and Dad, Dick and Jane, Puff and Spot, all living in their own little house. Now, that's not the case as it used to be. Now, the extended mutual household, at a time of economic distress, what is the ultimate social safety net? It's the family, and that's what's happening. Okay, now what else is happening to the boomers? Oh yes, the warranty has begun to expire on their parts. And as a consequence, and worse than that, we've got new research that just tells us the boomers are not as healthy as their own parents were at the same age. Wow. 2/3 of boomers are obese. 1/3 of them are, 2/3 are overweight and 1/3 are obese. So what does that got to do with the future of real estate? Oh, everything. Over 65-year-olds consume most of the health care. And if they're not as healthy as their parents were, they're going to consume even more health care. These are the BLS forecasts of the 15 industries who will experience the greatest increase in employment over the next 6-8 years. And 5 of them, those highlighted in yellow, are all in healthcare. Hospitals, offices of medical practitioners, labs and outpatient services, home health care industries. Wow. In fact, what we now know is that healthcare is the largest industry in America, and because the boomers consume, over 65-year-olds consume 2/3 of healthcare costs, as that population explodes, the biggest industry in America is only going to get bigger, and it's going to get bigger really fast. Healthcare is now 17% of the gross domestic product. By 2020, it will be 20% of the gross domestic product, and by 2025, according to the Congressional Budget Office, 1/4 of the American GDP will be generated by healthcare. Not since agriculture was the dominant economic activity of the country have we had a single industry generate 1/4 of our gross domestic product. This is a very big and important feature of the future from now on. Healthcare currently employs about 1/8 of all the workers in America, and it will, 1 out of 4 new jobs is created in healthcare right now today. So if you've got a young person that you need to advise on career choices, tell them to go into healthcare. You can't go wrong. 1 out of 5 U.S. jobs will be in healthcare by 2020. It will dominate the labor market. And one other thing, the health industry is consolidating. Just 10 years ago, the health industry was made up of lots of small businessmen, individual doctor practitioners with their own little operations. They have begun to sell those operations to local hospitals or to insurance companies or HMOs to get out from under the high cost of malpractice insurance and the federal requirements that they install electronic medical record systems. In 2005, 2/3 of all medical practices were owned by doctors themselves. Today, it's 1/2. In another 5 years, only 1/4 of medical practices will be owned by doctors. The rest will all be parts of national chains of hospitals or health insurance companies, etc. So it's part of now a mass marketization of healthcare into a super business, a service business. Indeed, one of the other things that's going to happen is that as individual doctors are, first of all, scarcer, we're going to be short 150,000 doctors in another 8 years, that what they're saying, okay, we need to have a better way to mass serve society. And so what we're going to do is open storefront clinics. And both CVS and Walgreens expect to open over 1,500 such clinics in 5 years. In addition, local hospitals, in order to get people from coming in and using their emergency room for regular care, are opening storefront clinics, or what they call retail medical service clinics, all over the country. Indeed, the demand for healthcare will be so great that entire shopping malls are being converted into medical malls, where they've got the foot doctor, the eye doctor, the allergist, the plastic surgeon. They've all got little storefront offices there, plus a place to park the kids while you're in getting your face lifted. I mean, it's going to be an impressive thing to have an entire economy dominated by healthcare as the principal employer and largest generator of value. Now, when we look at the BLS general forecasts of the economy, what is it that we see? First of all, we can take a look and they say, well, we're going to generate 15 million new jobs over the current 10-year forecast period. That's about a 10% growth rate. Now, where are the jobs going to be other than healthcare? Well, what's the big growth areas? Well, first of all, there's healthcare, projected to grow at 25% growth rate over 10 years. Next up is professional, technical, and scientific services. They're growing almost as much, and it's a larger group, but it's a catch-all. In that catch-all are non-medical and non-educational, but all the other professions: lawyers, accountants, architects, engineers, etc. And that's the hope of our society and our economy, is that group of people. They're high value generators and they are high growth industry employers in the country. Then number 3 is now leisure. Leisure was a big engine for Florida, right? But take a look. Leisure is now projected to grow at about 8% per year. Wow, the overall economy is going to grow by about 10% a year, so the growth in leisure is lower than the growth of the general economy. Now, that could change. The new BLS forecast suggests that that number will grow by half if the administration's proposals to reduce the visa restrictions that were set up after 9/11, if they are reduced, because we cut about 50% of foreign tourism coming to this country with those regulations. And now, if we modify those regulations and ease them up, it could be a bonanza for especially destination locations like Florida. So this is something that's hanging in the wind, and we're not clear, of course, because there's no way to forecast politics, how that'll turn out, but it is a promising opportunity. Right now, leisure does not look promising. It's a slow growth industry. A fast growth industry, on the other hand, is construction, projected to grow at 18% compared to the economy at 10%. Now, a lot of people say, well, construction took a terrible hit during the recession. Oh, indeed it did, because we did overbuild houses, we did overbuild shopping malls, etc. But all of the construction industry is not driven only by growth. It's also driven by replacement. And the Brookings Institution and Urban Land Institute jointly issued a report about 5 years ago in which they said, okay, here's the projected amount of new construction in America from the year 2000 to 2030. And it's going to be 212 billion square feet of construction. That'll be broken down 108 million in residential, of which, a third is going to be replacement construction and 2/3 growth. In commercial and industrial, almost half, 45% of the projected construction will be replacement construction, and 52 billion square feet of growth construction, totaling 96 billion. In industrial, almost all of the construction will be in replacement of existing plant and capacity, with only about 1 billion in growth. Indeed, now, let's put that in comparison to what's already in place. What the Brookings people did to demonstrate that, they said, well, we started the century with 302 million square feet of built environment. All right, we're going to replace 88 billion of it, so that comes off that total, and here's as new construction. And then we've got growth. There's 124 billion in growth, a total of 212 billion in construction from 2000 to 2030, and that will leave 212 billion in pre-existing space. So by 2030, almost half of all the built environment will have been built in the 21st century. That gives you a sense of the scale with which you're dealing. Construction and development clearly has great opportunities for growth out there. Now we need to find out where. Okay, we have to worry about one thing, however. The job creation rate is going down. That's one reason why the commercial space building is almost half of it replacement. We are generating fewer jobs every year. Back in 2000, for every 100 new Americans in the country, we generated 79 new jobs. And that figure has fallen steadily until by 2008, it had fallen to 49 new jobs for every 100 new Americans. What is happening that is causing our job creation rate to fall? Lots of people want to blame political policy, but that's not what the evidence tells us. The evidence tells us that it's the World Wide Web that has reduced our job generation capacity for two reasons. First of all, the automation of information work, or information. We see it every day. You see it around here. EasyPass or SunPass is eliminating the need for toll booth collectors. You just whiz through the toll booth that used to have a live person in it. Or when you walk into the airline terminal, there used to be a huge counter filled with airline clerks. Now there are kiosks that screw up everything that you do to them, and only one or two clerks to help you fix what the kiosk has done for you. You walk into the supermarket. There used to be 10 checkout counters with a person at them. Now only 6 have a person. The other 4 are self-checkout counters. So we are infomating out of existence. The ATM is eliminating bank tellers. Everywhere we look, we see the reduced need for actual workers because of sophisticated equipment made possible by the web. The other, of course, is the global economic integration. Once the Indians had demonstrated that they could, from their own homes in India, fix the Y2K problem in all the computer systems in America, which is indeed what they did for us. And once we got through Y2K and, oh, wow, the world didn't end, the computer systems didn't collapse, and the Indians said, well, what can we do for you now? We have fixed your Y2K problem. And of course, they could do lots of things for us. Until we had the World Wide Web, there was no way we could easily work with white-collar workers on the other side of the planet. Now it's no trick at all. And so that force is reducing the need for office workers in America, even as it reduces the costs of doing business for us. So that's what's happening in terms of the web. Now, there are jobs that are left. If you read the book, Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, he spends a whole chapter on, now don't worry about all this. There's a lot of jobs in America that are still untouchable, that they can't be automated out of existence and they can't be offshored. This is absolutely true. And most of them are in the service sector. Most of them involve people that are linked to their job by physically being there and doing the job, whether it's cutting hair or mowing lawns or repairing sump pumps. The problem is that because there is no way to increase the productivity of such service workers, they don't get paid very much. And since more and more of those workers that are still here and being utilized don't get paid much, the median income in America has been falling for decades. First, it was the median wage. It fell from 1980 through 2000. And then median household income began to fall after that. Wow, this all sounds, as they like to tell us, pretty gloomy. What happened to that high-tech revolution that everybody said was going to sweep across the country and make us all prosperous? Well, the economic historians say, it's still on the way, not to worry. It just hasn't gotten here yet. And meanwhile, you need to remember that the economic historians have told us that before every incident where new technology has caused a rising tide of productivity and prosperity, it is always preceded by what the economist Schumpeter called a wave of creative destruction. And what does a wave of creative destruction look like? It looks like that. And we are in the middle of it. I made these forecasts back in 1988. When I first got the data that enabled us to go back and look at the pattern of job creation as a result of the steam engine and of the electric dynamo. And we took those patterns and they were identical. And what it tells us is that most of the beneficial results of new technology doesn't arrive until about 60 years after the technology was first invented. And it requires that there has to be an infrastructure put in place. In the case of steam, the infrastructure was the railroad system. It took them 50 years to build that, and then you got the benefits of the steam power. In the case of electricity, it was the electrical grid. And it took about 40 years after the invention of the dynamo before somebody figured out how to underwrite and build an electrical grid that'll let everybody have electricity. Well, the World Wide Web is the infrastructure for the computer, and it didn't arrive until 1993-94. And then it took a while to get that installed once they'd invented it. So that now we have gone through the destructive part of the wave of creative destruction. See, the first thing that happens when a new technology becomes mature is that we use it to make our existing operations more efficient. You know, we apply it to new operations, eliminate lots of labor and unnecessary steps. So during the first part of an economic revolution, the number of middle and upper income jobs as a share of all the jobs in the country goes down as we eliminate lots of labor-intensive production and management jobs with the new technology. Now, the new technology also permits the creation of new high-value jobs and new products and services, but not right away. Eliminating workers from the old system is easy. It's a management task like shooting fish in a barrel. But to create new products that are really great, new services that people just have to have, that takes trial and error, experimentation, risk, venture capital. That's a slow process, but it's been going on steadily. And sometime around where we are right now, those two lines, the falling old high-value jobs and the new high-value jobs, cross over, and then we stop losing middle and upper income jobs in the economy, and it takes off. That should happen any time now. And when it does, I'll be a hero, because that's what I said was going to happen all that years ago. But the new data just out from BLS, and I'm just now looking at it, I'm not clear yet, but there seems to be some evidence that the turnaround has begun to occur. But I don't have a complete analysis yet. That takes about a month to massage that data. So here's we are in the bottom of this trough. This is major. We were making, about 70% of us were making middle and upper incomes, and we're now down to about 45% of households now with middle and upper incomes. That's a tremendous drop. And it's because we're in the middle of a genuine technologic revolution. This is the kind of moment they write about in history books. 50 years from now, entire history chips will be devoted to America in the information revolution. And they're going to explain how well or how badly we did in making that transition. Now, the funny thing is, here we are in the middle of a historic revolution. Does anybody talk about it? Do the leaders of either political party talk about how we're in a revolution? You haven't heard the word once. And why is that? Well, first of all, their advisors tell them, don't use the word revolution. You'll upset the electorate. And besides, if you say we're in a revolution, it admits that we're in the middle of a lot of economic change and turbulence that we don't have any control over. And no politician would ever admit that circumstances are beyond his or her control, even if it's true. So everybody's been silent about this mammoth thing that's happening to the American enterprise. As a consequence, many people, including many politicians and business leaders, do not understand the substantial and permanent change that is now going on in our country. Maybe there are some people in this room who do not appreciate the permanence of what is happening to us now. Everybody says, no, it's just another business cycle. It'll all be better in the future. And meanwhile, we've got to do something in the short term to help out. And because they did not admit that we're in revolutionary times, the politicians have done conventional things. They meant well, you know. I mean, first of all, in 2000, they had these huge tax cuts, both the income tax and capital gains taxes. And the Federal Reserve said, oh, and we'll drop the interest rates very low so it's easy for people to acquire things, to get credit. And roughly at the same time, rather as a coincidence, a bunch of mathematicians used computers to come up with these sophisticated new financial instruments, securitized debt obligations, derivatives, etc., which in effect increased the supply of capital all at once. Then, having cut the taxes to unsustainable levels, the United States then entered 2 foreign wars, and the Congress approved an enormous medicines, pharmaceutical benefits package to add to Medicare without increasing the taxes. So, as a consequence, the Feds ran up a huge debt, and they went out to sell that debt in the financial marketplace, and there were the Chinese with a huge amount of surplus dollars sitting over there from all of the things they had sold us, and they said, not to worry, we'll buy all your debt. Now, if the federal debt had had to compete in the financial marketplace for all of that borrowing, it would have driven up the interest rates and we wouldn't have run into these problems. But because the Chinese took that burden right out of the marketplace, it left the marketplace with low interest rates. And as a consequence, the buying public did exactly what we were expected to do. They went out on a buying binge. They became the driving force behind the U.S. economy, all using borrowed money. And what we saw was that home equity loan lines of credit amounted to about $1 trillion a year of additional gross domestic product for 6 straight years. As a consequence, consumer spending, which for years had represented 2/3 of the gross domestic product of America, jumped up to 72%. Even though household income fell during that entire period. Wow. A quarter of all the boomers bought second homes. The Florida real estate market was clearly a beneficiary of this credit policy and circumstances. Briefly, and it was mentioned by 2 speakers earlier today, 69%, that was the high water market, 69% of American households lived in their own homes before it all came apart. Now, a lot of people have said, nobody saw this coming. Absolutely nonsense. Every decent economist in the world saw it. If you read the Financial Times, you knew the disaster was coming. If you read the Wall Street Journal, you hadn't any sense in the world. Why is that? The journal is written for investors and Wall Street speculators. The Financial Times is actually written by real economists. And boy, were they upset. And indeed, in fact, Brooksley Born, who was Clinton's chief of Commodity Futures Trading Corporation, read one scholarly paper on securitized debt obligations and immediately wrote a paper herself, which she wanted to publish, saying that securitized debt obligations will wreck the financial markets. And Mr. Greenspan wouldn't let her publish it. So she sat on it for 2 years until the end of the Clinton administration. She was no longer embargoed. She published her paper. It came out late in August of 2011. And of course, in September of 2011, the nation's future was suddenly focused on another area altogether. And all of the economists said, ooh, don't tinker with the economy. We might be in serious trouble. So the whole thing was quashed. Now she gets $30,000 a speech to go around and tell people how she said this was coming. Lots of people were worried that the savings rate went negative in the United States in 2005. That there was this huge and growing commercial and consumer debt overhang. That some people demonstrated there aren't enough households to fill all the houses you guys are building. One great concern that 75% of all capital was invested in high-risk, unregulated things, securities. Well, the warnings came, but how many of you either saw the movie or read the book, The Perfect Storm? Right? What happened? The Andrea Gale got warnings. First, the Weather Service said, wow, 2 low-pressure areas are coming out. They're going to cross over one another. This is going to be a spectacular storm. And the Coast Guard said, this storm is going to be so terrible that if you get caught in it, we won't be able to send anybody out to get you. And the Navy said, this storm is going to be so ferocious, we are pulling all our assets out of the North Atlantic. And the folks on the Andrea Gale heard all that, but they also heard from other fishermen who were out on the banks that the fish were filling the nets in just a matter of a few minutes. Well, that's because with 2 low pressure areas, the fish all came up from the bottom and were right up on the surface. It was terrific. And so they decided to go for the boom rather than playing it safe. And that's exactly what American financial management did with all those warnings that they heard about what might go wrong. And of course, the economists were entirely correct that we did have a collapse. In 2007, the housing bubble burst, the recession began. We lost $60 trillion vanished from the world's capital supply, about a quarter of it in this country. 8.5 million jobs were lost. Commercial and consumer credit tightened up. So we now are witnessing the second piece of the new normal: prolonged economic austerity. This isn't going to get any better anytime quick. Now, there was, first of all, some response from the federal government. From the Republicans, there was bail out the banks. And from the Democrats, there was stimulate the economy. The total amount of money pumped into the economy, $1.5 trillion, was that enough to offset the collapse of the credit and housing markets? Every economist in the country agrees. Absolutely not. They all called for more stimulus. But the deficit hawks in Congress were worried about another question that they thought was more important. It was a question raised by Ben Bernanke in April of 2010 in a speech to the Dallas Chamber of Commerce, in which he said, you know, ultimately, we're going to have unsustainable debt if we do not intervene in current federal fiscal policy. We have either got to raise taxes or reduce entitlements or cut major programs, including defense and education, or some combination of those three, because we have to reduce our debt to GDP ratio, which is what the bank industry calls deleveraging. In fact, the whole economy needed to deleverage. McKinsey put out a wonderful report called Debt and Deleveraging. They looked at 45 cases of countries that needed to deleverage, that had asset bubbles of some kind since the Great Depression. And what they found was consistently that deleveraging follows all asset bubble collapses, that deleveraging typically takes 6 to 7 years, and on average it results in both the public and private sector reducing their debt load by about 1/3, and at that time, while employment stagnates or contracts. And it takes about 7 years to pull this off. Wow. Now, here we are trying to do something about it. First of all, the insistence that the public sector must do something about it. Well, they are. State and local governments was a feature article in USA Today, I think yesterday's front page, that said enormous drops, hundreds of billions of dollars of reduced expenditure by state and local governments, as well as increased taxes in many of those areas. They've reduced their debt load by about half of what they need to reduce. They still have to cut another half. But the feds have done only a modest amount of cutting because that requires political consensus. So in fact, what are we likely to see? Well, number one, we will see the age at retirement increase to 69 or 70 years of age. They won't announce that until after the 2012 elections are over, but everybody seems to be agreed that has to happen. That to broaden the public sector tax base, the Democrats are talking about providing citizenship or a possibility of earning U.S. citizenship to illegal aliens who do it through college or military service or community service. That's a wild card. If they did it, it would suddenly put somewhere between 7 and 11 million new wage earners in the tax base. It would be a bonanza for both state and federal governments if it's passed. It's very unlikely to pass if the Republicans are in charge, but politics is strange. Don't ever rule anything out, especially when there's that much money on the table. And then, of course, we're going to do something with the federal budget. We really don't know. Is it going to be mostly cuts or mostly additional taxes? And if so, where will those taxes come from? A complete change of rates? Or are we just going to go through and eliminate the deductibility of housing mortgage, for example? These are the kinds of things that are absolutely up in the air, but we know something has to be done. And there's a lot of other debt to deal with as well in the private sector. First of all, most of those bad bonds based on those sloppy mortgages are still out there on the bank's books, somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion worth. And we have to figure out some way to get rid of that debt, to offload that debt. Banks are still suffering. Last year, 92, 94 insolvencies or bank failures. That was better than the previous years when you had 140, 150. And we've already had 6 this year. The forecast is that about 1,000 banks will close. We started the recession with about 7,900 banks nationwide, and when it's all over with, there'll be about 6,700 banks left. A lot of banks are promoters of real estate and users of real estate themselves, and they're not going to be there. And then we've got pension funds. $4.1 trillion worth of underfunded pension funds, 2/3 of them public sector. Something's going to have to be done to resolve those things, and the losses will have to appear on somebody's books. Commercial real estate loans is about 1.4 trillion of the $11 trillion worth of commercial real estate loans in the country that are past due. They're being rolled over in the current financial market because the interest rates are so low, but there's a lot of zombie shopping malls and zombie office buildings out there that are only there because of the low interest rates. And we don't know what's going to happen to those and how those debts will be paid off. Consumer debt, we started out the thing with $1.4 trillion worth of consumer debt. It's now down to $1 trillion. On the other hand, student debt is going up. It now is more than consumer debt. Wow. And it's going up by about $100 billion a year. And a lot of people are saying, given the fact that college education is now not nearly as valuable as it was when the economy was booming, we may, in fact, be witnessing a credit bubble in this area. And there are now mounting demands saying the federal government ought to step in somehow or other and relieve all these students of this $1 trillion worth of debt burden. We don't know how that'll play out either, but it's an uncovered debt. And then about $700 billion in corporate commercial debt. Certainly the households of America are deleveraging themselves. They have reduced the consumer debt by about 10% a year since the crash first began. Mostly they've done that by defaulting on their debt. They haven't actually paid it off. And strategic mortgage defaults. Last year, 250,000 strategic mortgage defaults. And we already know that there are 10 or 11 million houses that are underwater in their mortgage and who are financially all right and who might find that, if there's no other form of relief, a useful thing to do. What else? Average household savings rate rose from 0 to 3.7 at points in the last 36 months. It's been as high as 8-9%. And a lot of people expected that to continue to grow over the near-term future. The average square footage of a new home sold fell 12% from 2006 to 2009. That's the first time that trend has reversed since the end of the Second World War. That's a major shift. By the way, households are getting smaller as well. The birth rates have plunged since the stock market collapse, and marriage rates have gone down, just like they did during the Great Depression in the 1930s. New car sales, as much as people glow about them, they're still a third below what they were during the peak years, and new housing sales are 3/4 below what they were. Our economy has and is still shifting gears to a lower gear ratio. And this is going to continue for some time. Consumer purchases and behavior will reflect a 5 to 10% reduction in actual consumer expenditures for at least 5 years and perhaps as long as 10 years. And the rental share of all housing will grow from 30% to 40% by 2020, with over 2/3 of all new housing units being built between now and 2030 as being rental. This has not been a business cycle recession, and things will never get back to the old normal, which is absolutely correct. We don't want to go back to the old normal. Remember, I just described to you what the old normal was. The number of new jobs created every year was going down. The average wage was going down. What we want is someplace where there's new jobs being created, and they're high-value jobs, and that wages are going up. And that is what the historical model tells us should now happen. But But of course, the politicians can't promise on that because they don't admit that there's been a revolution anyway. So they'll give you all kinds of reasons why they're going to try and intervene and make things better, but that ain't what's really going to happen. We have to hope that this is right. Now, do we have a new normal feature? You bet. Pervasive technology is a part of the new normal. Now we say, well, we've been living with technology forever. Yes, yes. But nothing like we're going to see from now on for the next 10 years. There are a lot of futurists that have described what the high-tech economy will look like. There are those who believe it'll be a high-tech manufacturing economy. There are those that it'll be a green high-tech economy. Certainly, the Obama administration's stimulus money has been substantially geared to encouraging green industries, electric cars, fuel cells, wind machines, etc. There are those who say, no, no, it's going to be this professional scientific folks. They're going to be the ones to generate all this new value. We don't know how yet, but they're going to be able to make use of this new technology. And then there's all kinds of infopreneurship, mini manufacturing, micro businesses that the IRS is really astonished by, the number of new little tiny businesses that make money, that pay taxes. Right. And so our rendezvous with austerity, through which we are going now, will end with a mashup with technology. And what are the things that we can tell you about this mashup? By 2020, after all we've heard, the U.S. economy will be paperless and it will be cashless. That's a for sure thing before 2020. Smartphones will be our e-wallets. These things will have everything in them. We'll simply wave them at vending machines when we want to buy a Coke. We'll wave them at the toll booth when we want to go down the highway. We'll wave them at the parking meters in order to pay when we go parking. This is what we'll pay with dinner with at the restaurant. All of the major credit card companies will introduce this year some form of system to enable you to use your smartphone as a payment mechanism. It's your electronic wallet. It's also going to be your electronic ID. That's how you'll get on the airplane. You'll simply show this and they'll say, yep, that's him. It's going to be great. It's going to have all your medical records on it because the electronic medical record system will be installed by 2020, which is another dimension of the future. The electronic medical record system will, in fact, reduce the cost and increase the quality of U.S. healthcare. It'll be wonderful. All of this is going to be driven by cloud computing, made possible by Web 5.0. Cloud computing offers a wonderful opportunity for commercial real estate because we're going to be building server centers all over the place. Lots of service centers are going into old Class B office space because it's built heavy enough to take the weight and the air conditioning. Right at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge in downtown Manhattan is a 32-story building that used to have telephone operators. It was the central switching system for New York Bell. Now it's all full of blade servers. And so we're seeing that all over the company. College campuses are building server centers. They're everywhere. They are the new factories of the information age, and they will boom and grow because by the end of this decade, nobody will have a computer that has its own memory, its own operating system. You'll simply download a virtual version of that from your cloud. What else are we going to have? The personal mobile technologies. No, there won't be a school textbook published after 2015. The industry's already said we can't keep going on paper. We're going to get all the lessons over our smart devices, our iPads, and we'll all be chatting with our technology, right? The Siri is only the beginning. Well, all of us have powerful cyber assistants that we can just say, listen, tell me what the tax rates are across the board in all the counties in southern Florida, and right away it's I got that for you, Chief, it's right here. How do you want it displayed? You want it graphic, pie chart, or we can just use a line graph? Thanks a lot. Not only will it be responsive, it'll also be trustworthy and a good sense of humor. How much more productive would each of us be if we'd all spent our lives with that kind of an assistant? Entertainment, e-entertainment, including games, will surpass the attendance and gate ticket price of all live events. The artificial world will become far and away the more productive, more valuable, more prosperous industry. And that poses a problem for a place like Florida, which provides real experiences and not simulacrums of experience. And about 2/3 of all the vehicles, or about 20% of all the vehicles in the country will be microcars or electric cars or e-cars. There'll be a lot of things that happen in the economy because of technology. One is, as I mentioned at the outset, more and more use of technology to reduce the need of labor in enterprise. So telecommuting will be commonplace. Oh, I don't have to build space. In fact, Sun Microsystems simply said to 2 big divisions, about 1,000 people, they just told them one Friday, that's it. Take all your stuff home. From now on, you're working out of your home. We want to terminate the leases on these office buildings. As well as e-tailing. Now, e-tailing will continue to grow. It's still less than 15%. It's closer to about 12% of total retail sales. So we're not going to see stores vanish. And certain commodities will be particularly popular on e-tailing. But we're not going to see a disappearance of the retail sector, but a slow erosion of it from e-tailing. In home building and in office making, energy conservation will be the norm because everybody now agrees the price of energy is going to continue to rise. Therefore, we need to reduce the cost. Both KB and Lennar have announced net zero homes. They said, with all these surplus new homes on the market, how do we attract anybody to houses we've just built? We will make them net zero homes. They will be self-sufficient. Does that only happen in the South where everybody can put solar panels? No. There's a development in Michigan where they use geothermal that goes through the 52 houses in the subdivision. And that way, combined with solar panels, they generate all their power themselves, and the surplus that they generate is sold back to Detroit Edison. And they are required by state law to buy it at market prices. That's going to be the trend from now on in new housing and new office buildings, period. And there's going to be a rise, and there already is a rise in philanthropreneurship. Because of the lopsided distribution of income in America, we now have a new wealthy class. It's not since the end of the 19th century have we had a class of plutocrats the size that we've got now. And a lot of them, because they're upset by what the Occupy people are saying about them, are demonstrating that they are not the Scrooges that they are portrayed, and they are funding all kinds of philanthropic activities, very often replacing functions that the city or the state has had to bail out on. Many state parks now are run by nonprofit organizations, and they hire the people back that used to work for the state, now work for the nonprofit. That's true across the board in a variety of activities, including housing developments, purpose-built communities, built by 3 billionaires, or underwritten by 3 billionaires, including the Oracle of Omaha. And I think there's at least one somewhere in Florida, where they are building mixed-use, mixed-income communities, usually having torn down big public housing arrays. And they are wonderful, and they absolutely are functional opportunities for development. And finally, the micro or infopreneurships, these micro businesses that I mentioned, or micro manufacturers. We now are able to use the same system with inkjets, but with material jets, to make three-dimensional copies of things. Right now you can buy a machine like that for hobbyists at about $1,500, and if you want a professional job, they're about $15,000. What we're going to see is little stores opening all over in the retail markets, so that you've got something you want to replace, drawer pulls on an antique piece of furniture, or game pieces, anything that's unique. I can go down and give them one, and they'll say, we'll make you a dozen of them. How much? You know, this is going to be an interesting local market. Global niche marketers, as the global market, especially the growing middle class of the developing world, a lot of them are buying things from the United States that we're the only ones who make them. So there's lots of opportunities that will result from the upswing in the number of high-value economic jobs generated by mature, high technology. We don't know what they are yet, but we can be fairly confident that that's what's happened in history before. There's no reason why it shouldn't happen now. But remember, the general public doesn't know that this is on the way. They've lost faith in the future, as we can see from a number of surveys of optimism. And so, in a consequence, a fourth dimension of the new normal is altered consumer expectations of their own lives. And in this, we see that what the behavioral scientists are telling us, just like the folks who lived through the Depression experienced what they call depression mentality, that those of us then who grew up with those parents heard about it all our growing up, about how they had to make do without and how they had to cut corners and so forth. Well, that same attitude now has settled in American consumers today as a result of the Great Recession. That they have much greater financial conservatism, they have more practical expectations. It's reflected in the fact that they say here that Americans who trust their full-service stockbrokers has fallen or has risen to almost half. Americans who distrust financial planners doubled from 18 to 31%. Americans who own their own homes, as already mentioned, dropped from 69 to 66, will be at 63 by 2020. And Americans who think homes are a safe investment, that's also gone down. So it's changed their whole attitude and expectations. Susie Orman, who for a decade went around telling everybody, spend, 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 don't worry about it. Your house is your piggy bank, and it refills itself. As soon as you've spent the money, more comes in. Now, she's changed course 180 degrees, and now she's saying, save, 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 don't spend. Spending is evil. I think retail stocks went down 10% when she published that new book. And a more thoughtful read by Richard Florida, who is an urban futurist, and who fundamentally says, now that people are moving back to cities and renting rather than buying homes, that will free them up to spend money on things that are more other than mortgages, cars, and gas. The experiential goods, that's good. Experiential goods is what the leisure world, the leisure activities of Florida offer. Experiences. All right, and now people are going to shift over and say, I want to have a real experience, not just something that's on the computer. New technologies, saving for retirement. It's a different place out there suddenly. Now, are people really moving back to cities, or is that just metaphorical? No, absolutely, it's true. Take a look at the number of residential building permits issued to the core urban area in these cities, including Miami. 2% in the 1990s, 16% in the early 2000s, and in 2007, 22%. All of them sharply rising. We are seeing people move to the cities to live. On the other hand, in 95 of the 100 largest U.S. metropolitan areas, the share of jobs that are within 3 miles of downtown fell between 1998 and 2006. We are moving toward a European pattern in which the businesses, employers are out of the center of the city and living is in the center of the city. So now the fifth and final dimension of the new normal is more urban living. We know this from a variety of factors. The Census Bureau says that, look, today, just over half the population lives in the 50 largest metropolitan areas, but they will experience 80% of all the population growth between 2000 and 2020. They'll be in the 50 largest cities. 2 of the biggest metropolitan areas in the country are in Florida, the Miami Atlantic Coast city and the Central Florida city. So you're well fixed there. This is all because the world has changed. It has nothing to do with anybody's policy interventions. The 50-year spread of suburban sprawl was fueled by cheap land, capital, oil, and cars. How many of you remember when you could drive into a gas station and buy a gallon of gas for 10 cents? If there was a gas war on, you got it for less. A new car, brand new car, still sold for under $1,000 in the 1950s. My first car did. So what we're looking at is different. Now is the consolidation, the movement of people into cities, into smaller units, into high-rise apartments is being driven by expensive land, capital, oil, and cars. That's the pattern. People say, well, where will we build in the middle of cities? They're already built. Ooh, there's all kinds of opportunities for these walkable urbanities. They don't actually have to be cities, you know. They can just seem like cities, feel like cities. I've been to some subdivisions that are 30 miles from downtown Washington, but they're built to look like brownstones in downtown Manhattan. And people love them. Artificial cobblestone streets and everything. Not only redoing existing business districts, but there's industrial and transportation conversions, like Atlanta Station in Atlanta, or the Pearl District in Portland. Old industrial railroad areas all converted over into brand new shining cities. Transit villages, these are the big ones. There are 300 of these going up at any kind of a mass transit system stop. Even if it's out in the suburbs, you build a little small urban village. The mall and auto dealerships both took big hits. Golf courses, we used to have 11,000 golf courses in the country. We're down to 10,000 golf courses. They're closing about 100 a year. Fewer and fewer people are playing golf. Wonderful blocks of land. Health-based, Medicare or healthcare is growing as an employer. They employ hospitals, huge amounts of people, and they need building arrangements around them, communities. And education. College campuses are turning the spare land in their campuses over. We have entered an era of intra-urban development. And the bulk of our growth and the relocation of people will all be taking place in the center city or in artificially created urban environments. So now, welcome to the new normal, where society will be older and there'll be fewer young people, where most individuals and institutions will have to live and operate within more limited means than they did during the 10 years before this, where technology will pervade every aspect of daily life and work and play, where there will be changing consumer expectations, and you're going to have to be attentive to them because we have no idea what people are going to do to adjust to these new realities, and that there will be increasingly urbanized living. We have now entered a future that will be considerably different from our recent past. The new normal is in effect, it is tangible, it is real, and there are opportunities to be acquired in the new normal as long as you understand what we're talking about and realize the new normal really is different from the old world. Thank you very much.